All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving into a part of history that's as wild as it is disturbing. Imagine this: a group of people get together and say, you know what? We need to rebrand Jesus. Too Jewish. Let's make him Aryan instead. Like what? Who decides that? But it happened. Here's the thing: this didn't start with the Nazis. The ideal of an Aryan Jesus had roots way earlier in 19th century scholarship. People were out here writing books and giving lectures and making up complete nonsense about Jesus being some blue haired, blonde eyed guy who transcends his Jewishness to become the perfect Aryan. It just wasn't fringe. They tried to make it academic, respectable. And then the Nazis took that ball and ran with it. They rewrote the Bible. Yeah, I'll wait. They rewrote the Bible, created Nazi hymnals, and even tried to cancel Paul because, oops, Paul was Jewish. So how does something like that happen? And why does it even matter today? That's what we're getting into. My guest, Susannah Heschel, wrote the book, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologies and the Bible in Nazi Germany. She's got the receipts on how faith was weaponized, how theology was manipulated, and what that says about power and belief. This one's going to blow your mind. Let's start the show. Dr. Susannah Heschel is a renowned scholar and the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. She's an expert on the intersection of religion, race, and politics. And her groundbreaking book, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologies in the Bible in Nazi Germany, explores how faith was manipulated to fit Nazi ideology. Her work challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about history, faith, and power. Welcome to the show, Dr. Heschel.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So I want to dive right in here and ask, what made you look at this topic and say, this is a subject I've got to write about?
Well, I came to this topic in a way by accident. So I was still a graduate student and I was writing a dissertation about a 19th century Jewish scholar named Abraham Geiger, who wrote a great deal about the relationship between Judaism and Islam and Judaism and Christianity. And as a student, I happened to be in Berlin uh, working on my German. And I visited a professor at an institute and he was delayed. So I browsed through the library. And there I found some books published during World War II in Germany, collections of articles written by, in some cases, well known German theologians, Protestants. And I started thumbing through and I this is crazy. I'm reading anti Semitic propaganda. And so I became interested in that question of, well, what were Christian theologians doing during World War II? And why were they writing horrible things about Jews? And who were these people? Especially considering during a war, there was a paper shortage. So how did they publish these volumes and so on? So that's how I started investigating.
So what was going on back then to make people even think that this is a great idea? Let's just start writing this stuff.
So, first I would have to say that this was in particular shock to me because I grew up as the daughter of a professor, Jewish theologian, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was involved in the civil rights movement. And for me, religion and racism, religion was the greatest force against racism, it seemed. Dr. King and the civil rights movement put the Bible at the forefront. So reading these German theologians was a special shock. But how did this come about, you asked? Well, first of all, one can trace the roots. I mean, you could go back to the 2nd century to a man who was declared a heretic named Marcion, who
Mm.
said that the God of the Old Testament was a different God from the God of the New Testament. And the idea that Marcion came up with actually was revived in the 19th century by some German Protestants who said Luther got rid of the Catholic Church,
Mm.
purified Christianity of Catholicism, and now it's time to purify Protestant Christianity of Judaism. And of course,
Mm.
these were problematic. I mean, first of all, Jesus was a Jew. Paul was a Jew. The disciples were told, what do you do? And there are all kinds of passages in the gospel. Jesus goes to a synagogue and preaches, goes to the temple and so on. So what do you do with this? Well, first they said the Old Testament, we have to throw it out. And this already at the beginning of the 20th century. And when Hitler came to power, Actually, it was something that they embraced because these were theologians who were German nationalists and
Mm.
who wanted a manly church. They didn't like it that so many women were in the pews and not enough men. And they wanted an anti Semitic church. So Hitler gave them some, let's say, support initially. They were very happy to be included, to be marching in the Nazi parades at the head of the march. By the summer of 1934, Hitler realized that he had nothing to worry about from the churches, that he sort of had them in his pocket, that they were not going to rile up resistance against the Nazis. So he was no longer interested, and this frustrated them. They wanted Hitler to be attentive to them, to give them support, to respect them. What could they do? And they decided in a series of meetings by 1937-38 that really what they could contribute as theologians, I mean, they're not in the army, they're not, soldiers, but what they could contribute was anti-Semitic propaganda. And as the Nazi regime became more and more anti-Semitic in a very loud way, vulgar way, these Christian theologians felt that they said that they were contributing on the what they called the spiritual battlefield in defense of Germany, getting rid of the Jews and anything Jewish about Christianity. And by the way, some of them were afraid that the Nazis would not like the church because the church was too Jewish. So it was also a way of saying, you see, we're getting rid of all this Jewishness. And there were Nazis who said that, who said Christianity is just another form of Judaism. They also wanted to join the SS. The SS was not open to theologians on the grounds that theologians were obeying God. And the SS has to have a sworn loyalty only to Hitler. So I found it in archived letters begging Himmler, let us join the SS. We're so loyal, even though we're ministers, pastors. But Himmler said no. And so some of them wore little pins. They became what was called at the time supporting members of the SS. And, the SS was deemed a criminal organization. SS was the one that ran all the concentration camps, the death camps, and the murder process against Jews, against Sinti and Roma, against political prisoners, against the Polish elite. They were murderers. And yet that's what these theologians wanted because the SS was the elite in the Third Reich, and they wanted that.
So first of all, I'm just wrapping my mind around this group of people. Like, did they create a club? They create an organization? Like, how did they come together to do this?
Well, they did come together and they called themselves by a somewhat, misleading name. They called themselves the German Christian Movement. And you hear that and you think, well, anybody who's a German and a Christian, but no, this is a special group that was pro-Hitler. They managed to gain control of most of the state churches. So each state had its own official Protestant church. The theological faculties where people trained to become a minister. They had the money of the church,
Hmm.
in their pocket. And, in Germany, everybody paid a certain amount of tax dollars to the church, either Protestant, Catholic, or to the Jewish community. So they organized themselves and actually in 1939 formed what they called the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Religious Life. So this organization had plenty of money, could do really almost anything they wanted. In the archives, I didn't find many complaints, actually, that they didn't have the resources they needed. What did they do? So they formed committees of professors and pastors and bishops, and they revised the Bible. So they got rid of the Old Testament, they took the New Testament, and they rewrote it. There were several efforts to rewrite, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, what, blessed are the peacekeepers? This is not acceptable in a Nazi society, so they had to rewrite it. They had to get rid of everything Jewish, Jesus going to a synagogue and so on. Now, Paul was a problem. What do you do with Paul? Because he tells you he's a Jew. Right? With Jesus, it was a little bit ambiguous. He never says I'm a Jew, but he does Jewish things. So, all right. They decided Jesus was an Aryan. He was from the Galilee, from the north, which had the reputation of being not a very Jewish part of the land of Israel. And in the north, in the Galilee, Jesus was well received by fellow Jews who were, they argued, not really racially Jewish. They were racially Aryan. But some of them practiced Judaism because the Jews had forcibly converted them to Judaism, so they argued. And then Jesus went to Jerusalem, Judean area, where the Jews dominate. And there, what happened to him? He was put to death. So they argued that the death of Christ, this was something that Hitler was taking revenge for. The Jews had killed Jesus. Now Hitler was going to kill the Jews. Now that was one project. Paul was a problem, and they essentially took out all of the autobiographical passages from Paul, and they took certain passages from the Pauline epistles and mixed them together with passages from the Gospel of John, which is a very anti-Jewish gospel. And so they published a New Testament, which they sold to churches all over Germany. Then they published a hymnal. And the hymnal has Jewish words such as Amen, Hallelujah, Her Tzvaot, all these words. And it has hymns written by Jews who had been baptized, but that racially, under Nazi law, even if you've been baptized, a Jew is a Jew. So they took out anything written by a baptized Jew, and they took out words like Hallelujah, and they came up with German substitutes. So they published their hymnal and sent it all over the country. They wrote a catechism. They also, and all kinds of other propaganda, learned articles, but also popular pamphlets for people. When I was a graduate student, I met Germans who had grown up during this period and said to me, yeah, my pastor told me that Jesus wasn't a Jew, he was an Aryan. And I, of course, believed him. I was 13. What should I, So we have also a generation that grew up during this period and then reached adulthood after World War II, but continued some of the traditions. And that was also interesting for me to investigate.
So I am wrapping my head around this. As you know, I've read your text, and hearing you say it aloud makes it even more real. So we've created this group, um, this coalition of such, to eradicate Jewishness out of Christianity altogether. Jesus isn't, to them, Jesus isn't Jewish. Jesus is Aryan. And Galilee is a land that's been taken over by the Jews, but it really was more Aryan. And so we're going to rewrite the Bible and get rid of the Old Testament because that God's different. But how do you write the New Testament without referencing the Old Testament? So that doesn't exist, but we keep going back and getting parts of it and putting it in here. And then, I mean, just the insane, just for myself listening. I tell people in my book, I grew up on the third pew of the church in small town Texas, Christian, and I'm listening to this like, if you said this today, I'm thinking this just would not fly. But did they believe this? These scholars who, backed it up and wrote all of this stuff, who wanted to be a part of the SS and who wanted clout in some sort of way, did they believe this stuff, or was this just a way to get big?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I wondered about that myself. Did they really believe what they were saying? Um, I think they did, actually. They saw themselves as liberal theologians, which means they could look at the Bible as a historical document and use historical methods to analyze the text of the Bible. So they argued, for example, that there are passages in the Bible, in the Gospels, that seem sympathetic to Judaism, that Jesus says things. And they said, well, this is a falsification, that these are verses that Jews deliberately inserted into the New Testament, and they have to be removed. So they thought they were sort of cleansing the Bible of any erroneous additions that had been inserted. So in that sense, they thought of themselves as doing very sophisticated scholarly work to restore the original pristine version of the Gospels. Now, did they really believe this? I think they did. And I think we should also, excuse me, thank you. We should also remember that there has been a long tradition in some elements within the church that have said that Judaism is a bad or degenerate influence on Christianity. Or, more mildly, people who wanted to simply have a border, a boundary between Judaism and Christianity, which is really impossible to achieve because, as you just said, so much of the New Testament is presented as fulfilling the Old Testament. So how can you separate the two? That's the question. Could this kind of approach that really separates the two religions, could it be viable? Could it be accepted outside of a Third Reich? But I think there's another issue here too, which is what is the relationship between religion and racism?
Mm.
And how is it that religion functioned in this situation as a justification for racism? How did that work? And I ask that in part because of my childhood, that the Bible was central to the civil rights movement in the United States. The
Mhm.
Bible was the basis for rejecting racism. So how did the Nazis do this, these Nazi theologians? And that's where it gets tricky. Essentially, they had to say, let's say you're a Jew and you get baptized. Now, baptism is a sacrament. If you're baptized, you're a Christian. That's it. That's what Christianity declares. And that problem for them was that the Nazi racial laws said, no, even if you're baptized, a Jew is a Jew. You remain a Jew. That's it. So how could they reconcile this? That was the problem. So they took, for example, Galatians 3:28, the verse in Paul's epistle that says, in Christ there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. Okay. And they said, look, when you go to church, you walk into church, all these people sitting there have been baptized, right? Okay. But they're men and women. You see them. Some are men, some are women, which means that baptism does not overcome your gender. You don't lose your gender when you're baptized. You remain male and female. And so too, you don't lose your race. A Jew remains a Jew. So for them, the Bible says, in that sense, that baptism and the Nazi race laws are in agreement. Your racial identity persists. And this had practical consequences because there were, in fact, Jews who had been baptized, sometimes as babies, sometimes as adults. They went to church every week or maybe occasionally, but people knew them in the parish, pastor knew them, the priest, Catholic, Protestant. So what happens when they go to church starting in September 1941 and they
Mm.
wear a yellow badge to mark them as Jews, even though they've been baptized? So they come into church, and there are memoirs about this. And one older man was told, we don't want to see you sitting here in the pews. You go sit up in the choir loft where no one can see you. A woman who sang in her Catholic church choir was told, you can't sing anymore. A woman told a pastor, don't bless my child with your hand if that hand shook hands with a Jew. There are people who complained that these Jews, these baptized Jews, were next to them at the communion rail. And they didn't want that. So that becomes very interesting because it shows us that the idea was ingrained even in the popular mind
Mm.
that baptism still means you're still a Jew, despite the baptism.
So
And then,
all this
yeah,
division, because it sounds like this is just a perpetuation that we even see today, but just using this to divide, to separate, to say the Jews are different from these people. So these are the laws and these are the literal readings of the Bible, not serious, but literal readings of the Bible that we're going to take. My question I think I'm coming to is about this using Christianity as a means for control. Like why did they care so much about Christianity? What was it about Christianity? Because you mentioned also that they came after Catholicism. Like, what was it about Christianity?
Well, I think that they were, first of all, people were excited about Hitler. They were entranced by Hitler. There were churches that had swastika flags flying in front. There were churches that put a swastika next to the cross on the altar in the church and on the masthead of the church newspaper,
Mm.
until finally, actually, the Nazi party said, no, the swastika is only for the Nazi party. You can't use it. And then I found letters in an archive from pastors who said, no, no, please let us keep the swastika. It means so much to us to have it on the altar, etc. So, yeah, there was a newspaper called Kussenkreuz and Hakenkreuz, which in English is the Christian cross and the swastika. But in German, both are called a Kreuz, a cross.
Mhm.
So it had an alliteration, but they had to take that off. They had to change the title of the magazine, the church magazine. But what was it? Well, J. Cameron Carter wrote an important book called Race, a Theological Account. And he draws the connection between how Christianity tries to cope with its distinction from Judaism and how white people try to formulate their distinctiveness from people of color. And then that becomes an important question. I do think that when we look at such things, of course we see the evil, the horror, the cruelty, the hate.
Mm.
That's so clear to everybody. I think in addition, I would just add there was a problem here, an anxiety. When I think about the woman who told the pastor, don't bless my child if you shook hands with a Jew. Where is that coming from? What is that about? I do think there's an anxiety within Christianity about whether Christianity is part of Judaism or a separate religion, or if there's something Jewish within Christianity, just like these baptized Jews with their yellow stars coming to church, Jews within the church.
Mm.
It's like something bad, something foreign, something degenerate, something horrific entering the Christian space. But it's not just the space of the church, it's also the religion itself, the Jewishness within the religion. And there's an anxiety about that. And the question is, why? Why the anxiety? Why is there so much discomfort? And why is there always this need to draw a boundary between the two, to define this is the Christian, that's the Jewish, rather than celebrate the similarities, the connections, the presence of one within the other? Why isn't that a form of celebration, of rejoicing?
I think that and I may be messing up the title, but the late Toni Morrison wrote a book, The Origins of the Other, where she asked some similar questions, this need to create an other instead of a celebration and an embracing of. I want to move on to these scholars because, again, my mind is still resting on. So you've rewritten this New Testament Bible without an Old Testament, and you've rewritten hymns, and now you've delineated people with yellow badges and who can sit where and who can't be touched, almost like who can drink out of this water fountain and who can't come in the front door of the restaurant, who can't sit at the counter, who can't use the same restroom. All of those things that we've seen happen, and I'm wondering, so this nonsense is perpetuated by the scholars, theologians who wanted this clout. Hitler dies, the war ends. What happened to these scholars, these people who said, no, this is what it is? What happens after the war ends? Are they persecuted for their actions, or what happens to them?
Well, unfortunately, when the Allies at the end of the war divided Germany into four sectors, Russian or Soviet, American, British, and French, they looked at Germany and they wanted to denazify the country, but they would have lost everybody. I mean, if they got rid of all the people who were members of the Nazi party, they would have no teachers, no judges, no lawyers, no doctors, no nurses. I mean, it would have been impossible. And what would those people then do? Just sit around all day if they lost their jobs? How can you create a society? So they put into effect certain regulations about when you join the party. If you join the party very early, before Hitler came to power, then you would lose your job. And if you join later, it wasn't considered not so bad. You weren't quite as enamored, which is problematic because in some sense, it was after Hitler came to power during the 30s when people in Germany saw worse and worse things that he was doing, the concentration camps and expelling Jews and so on. Okay, but that was the decision of the Allies. And as a result, they went through a denazification process. So people like these theologians, some of whom had joined the party before 1933, had to come up with some kind of defense. So what did they say? First, they said, well, look, I'm a Christian. How could you possibly think I would be a Nazi? And the Americans were very naive about that. People would say, I went to church every week. So how would you possibly consider me a Nazi? And again, that was a good excuse. Or they would say, look, what am I? I teach Bible. I'm an unworldly person. I don't know anything about politics. And the Americans would buy that. The other thing they did was to get their friends to write letters of support for them. Now, who were their friends? They were also Nazis. So one Nazi wrote for the other Nazi, and then, okay. In this case, a lot of them would write, I was not anti-Semitic. I simply wanted to defend the church against Hitler because Hitler wanted to close the churches. So I was defending the church. So they got off. Most of them got off. And they continued as doing whatever they were doing, as pastors, as professors. A few of them lost their professorships, but not that many. And some who lost their professorship were replaced by other former Nazis. So, yeah.
And I want to talk about that in terms of faith, because I do think you said something very profound, which is we follow the commandments just as they followed the laws of Hitler. Like we are good at following these things that we hold to be sacred and true or relevant for us in those moments. And so I'm wondering, why do you think that faith is so powerful when it comes to controlling people? Like, how did the Nazis figure out that rewriting the Bible could literally reshape how people saw the world?
Well, let me just say, I think what you're touching on is one of the big problems that all scholars have, which is I can look at propaganda material. I can see how many copies of a pamphlet were published, how it was distributed. But how do I know how it affects people? Some people can read something and say, this is garbage. This is racist garbage. And some people can read it and say, oh, there's an interesting point. But it's very hard for us scholars to be able to measure that, to measure the response. So do we really know the impact of this? No, we don't. We really can't quantify the impact. And I can't say it's because of these theological writings that people became anti-Semitic. But I would say that the presence of such texts manages somehow to, I think, weaken or even remove the possibility of using the Bible against Hitler and against anti-Semitism. It's saying, it's trying to put the Bible on the Nazi side, and then we lose the opportunity to protest with the Bible. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say these theologians were one piece in a much bigger effort. There was plenty of propaganda that the Nazi Party produced. So these weren't the only people producing this kind of propaganda. That's true. Then I think, if you go to church and you hear a pastor wearing long black robes in a beautiful church saying things about how dangerous and horrible Jews are, you take it more seriously. It goes more into your heart, I think, than if you hear a politician.
Yeah, he's an authority, and faith is such a huge part of or the way that faith has been done is that it instills a level of fear, that you want to do right, you want to go to heaven, you want to, you know, say that I checked off all the boxes to say that I am a good and righteous human being. That I think that by the time we get to rewriting the Bible and rewriting hymns to be anti-Semitic and to remove like every ounce of Jewishness, to create stories and fake news in a sense that, oh no, Jesus was Aryan, you know, things of that nature, that we've now instilled a level of fear that whatever the propaganda, it has to be multi-pronged because at some point it's going to reach people's insecurities.
Yes.
And that's when it begins to ring true. And so I'm wondering from you, what do you think that the effect that that has had on today?
Huh. Well, that's an important question. It's hard to say exactly, but I would first say that how is it possible for holiness to coexist with hate?
Hmm. Sorry, I just have to say that is a put it on the t-shirt moment. That is the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. And yet we see it all around. We see it everywhere. I mean, this is not this my book was about the Nazi period, but the problem itself is universal, and we know that. And it's not limited to Christians. There are people who see themselves as holy and are filled with hate in every religion, including Judaism, including Islam and Christianity, even Buddhism, which we think of as, the religion of peace. And so, yeah, all religions have this problem. So how do we understand that? What is it that hate accomplishes for people striving for holiness?
Mm,
I think hate brings a level of passion into people's lives. And they don't know how to arouse passion in themselves. So hate gives people passion, and they think that that passion will intensify their drive for religious experience and for holiness. That's the danger. So
mm,
maybe what we need to do is be careful about the passion that we invoke in places of worship and within religions.
mm.
Where do we find that passion? Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about religionless Christianity. I've been to synagogues that are passionless. I've been to churches that are passionless. There's no passion there.
Mm.
No passion. It's just so, yeah. And that's a problem.
Yes. As I grew up, my grandmother used to say, I'm not going to no dead church.
Yeah,
That's what she would call it.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
As we wrap, two more things. One, your book. What would you want people to take away from your book, The Aryan Jesus?
Well, I guess on the one hand, I think it's important for all of us who want to understand the Nazi period to include what was going on in the churches, because sometimes the history books will tell us everything, even how often the mail was delivered, just every little detail, but nothing about what was being preached in the churches. And the reality is, people did go to church in those days. So, what were they hearing? What was going on? So, one thing is just as a historical element. But then I think I would like people to take away the larger question of religion and racism and how the two can possibly go together. They do, and they have, and they continue to. So we need to think about that. What is it that racism does for religious people as they imagine? What is in their minds?
Mm,
Why? And how can we address that and change it? How does religion interact with authoritarian fascist regimes, for example? How does religion coexist with corrupt regimes? Sometimes what we call authoritarianism is really about corruption. It's about a political leader who wants to have a big bank account for himself, his family, and his friends. So there's a moral question here, too. How does religion allow corrupt people to get away with their corruption?
Mhm.
There's too much corruption around us. So, how does that happen? And how does religion do the opposite of what Dr. King was trying to accomplish, both in terms of a larger society, but also in terms of individuals? I was amazed. Dr. King could really soften hardened hearts,
Mhm.
invoking the Bible. So, what happens in a situation when either we confront hardened hearts, or how how is it that religion can actually make hearts hard, make people callous, when we assume that a religious person can never be callous or indifferent, but in some cases it can? We need to study that and be aware of it and be cautious about it. I think that should be a topic included in every seminary for every religion. How to beware that your religion does not make people callous, make them callous.
Mhm. Thank you. I wanted to, before I let you go, thank you for joining me for this time. But I've been having a full circle moment talking to you. I think Oprah calls them full circle moments. But I started this YouTube channel a year ago and started with these, what a friend of mine, a Bonhoeffer scholar, called atomic lectures, where I come on and for a few minutes just, give these my points of view. And really, I wrote all of these around the premise that there is something sacred in every moment. Now, I do not like to Google people. Even if I'm going on a date, I like to meet the person in the moment and experience. It's just me. I'm a bit old school that way. My nickname in my family's Old Man. So I had gone through your text, I had gone through your bio. I did not Google you to realize that you were Rabbi Abraham Heschel's daughter.
That's
And this entire show was based off of your father saying that there is something sacred in every moment. Hence the name of the show, Heart of the Moment, because at the heart of the moment, beyond the hashtags of the sound bites, there is something sacred. And I got that from your father and had no idea
oh,
to be talking to his daughter today. And so
oh,
for me, this is a full circle moment that is not only confirmation, but a joy and an honor to be sitting and talking with you. So thank you
thank you.
so much.
Thank you. It was great to be with you. I appreciate it.
Here's the thing: history isn't just something that happened, it's something we're living with every day. When people twist faith and rewrite scripture or manipulate language, they're not just changing words, they're shaping beliefs, policies, and our lives. And the scary part? It's easy to slip into thinking those changes are truth because they're wrapped in authority and tradition and the things we've been taught not to question. But questioning is where liberation starts. It's where we peel back the layers and ask, who decided this? Who benefits from it? And who's being harmed? Faith can be a tool for control, yes, but it can also be a tool for freedom. It depends on who's holding it and how it's being used. And if we don't confront these moments where history and belief collide, if we don't examine the way language and faith have been weaponized, then we risk letting it happen again and again. The beauty of faith isn't in its perfection, it's in its pursuit for truth, justice, and love. So let's keep asking questions, digging deeper, and challenging what we've been told. Because what we might find is that it just might change everything. I'm Karmen Michael Smith, encouraging you to let disruption be the catalyst for your liberation.